Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by onlinegreatbooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast. Today we're going to talk about Hamlet, and we have Trent back. He was with us on the first episode, and we decided it was time to do some more. And he picked Hamlet, which I hadn't read, Trent, since I was probably 14 years old. And that in and of itself, just the experience of reading something important that you haven't read in 30 years is pretty interesting. We could do a show just about that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, it's been probably been about 10 years since I've read it. So, you know, it was an interesting experience coming back to it after a long layoff, for sure.
So you said, hey, let's read Hamlet. Okay, fine. I bought the Norton Critical Edition, the complete Hamlet, the complete Shakespeare. That's what I ended up reading it out of here. I read the combined text or combined all the quartos and the folio.
Right. And
I thought about getting the Folger, but I don't know. I was like, if I start buying those Folger editions, I'm going to have like, I don't know, 3 pallets of those things. So I was like, I'm not even going to get started. But anyway, I got the book and it came in and I was like, okay, this is next in my list. I had to read Canterbury Tales first. And then when I picked up Hamlet, I was like, I was worried about it. I was intimidated somehow. Before I even really opened it and even read the first page, the players, I found that I was intimidated and worried about it, which was interesting.
Sure. Yeah. You know, I think, and that's something I definitely want to talk about. I think that's a great place for us to start before we get into the play, is that...
That's where I had to start.
Right. You know, a lot of us, and this is a common theme that you talk about in Online Great Books, is that a lot of people feel like they're not smart enough somehow to read the great works. And that sometimes people are put off by what they perceive as material that was meant for people that were more educated, smarter, just better with words than they are.
Right.
And what I think Shakespeare is the quintessential modern writer. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but I think Shakespeare was one of the first, maybe not the first, but he was certainly one of the greatest of all time at creating characters that are real, that are recognizable, creating real people and bringing them to life on the stage. And, you know, in the podcasts we've done up to date, we've mainly covered ancient literature, right? We've talked about Homer, talked about Plato, and there's not as much, narrative or there's a little bit less storytelling in Plato, but especially with Homer, the ancient literature, I think, hadn't yet developed that sense of bringing real people to life through the page or through the poetry. That was the medium of the time. It was poetry. We need to remember that it wasn't written as a novel, as we're used to today, but I think Shakespeare is one of those touchstones for modern culture in that he created characters that are sarcastic, that lie, that cheat, that deceive, that say one thing and mean another, and sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally.
Yeah.
Right. He was also great at writing multi-layered plots that had a lot of irony in them.
Oh yeah.
And these are things that we all take for granted.
He could Tarantino on these things, right? Like in Hamlet. In Hamlet, there's a play in a play. There's like an A plot, B plot, through F plots. Yeah, and they all come together at the very last scene.
Exactly. So when I think when people reference today, maybe like really well done, high production TV shows that are made with a great sense of artistry and craftsmanship, that this is what Shakespeare was. I mean, he started this. And I'm sure somebody would argue with me, well, there's certainly modern writers before Shakespeare. Yes, there were. Arguably, Cervantes was the first modern writer. But my point is that a lot of these things that we take for granted in modern storytelling, Shakespeare at least perfected them. And so his works are very accessible even today. And I think where people get hung up on is the language. His language is dense, it's multi-layered. He's throwing jokes left and right. He's making quips, puns, insults, and they're all layered into language that's also driving along the plot, right? And so I think a lot of people get caught up in that. And here's the key point that I want to make. And if you get nothing else from this episode, I hope that you get this. Shakespeare is meant to be seen, not read.
Right.
And that, I can't stress that enough, that, Shakespeare wrote for the stage. And what we're reading when we pick up a book that has Hamlet in it, we're reading the screenplay. So, if that's your only experience with one of his works, that's kind of like saying, hey man, have you seen that Star Wars movie? And he's like, well, no, but I read the screenplay.
Right.
And you're like, what are you talking about? You didn't see any of the space battles? You didn't see the lightsabers? You didn't see you didn't see anything, right? That's kind of what we're doing when we read Shakespeare. We don't get any of the benefit of the actors interpreting the lines. And, Shakespeare wrote, he was pretty famous for writing with very, very few stage instructions. There's very little in the way of notes as to the settings of each of the scenes and what the actors, how they move across the stage, how they're positioned. Most of that was left up to the interpretation of the actors and whoever the stage director was. But the point is that those actors bring the language to life. And it was a revelation for me when I studied abroad. I was fortunate enough, I got to study abroad outside of London when I was in college. And so I went to London and I went to the Globe Theatre. And the Globe is a reconstruction of what, to the best scholars know, of Shakespeare's main playhouse where he would have put on most of his plays. And so they've studied as whatever records are left of what that stage looked like, of what that whole theater looked like, and they've reconstructed it. And they put on modern Shakespeare productions, and there's some really top-notch actors that perform these plays today. And I saw King Henry IV Part 1, which has got one of Shakespeare's famous comic characters, but it's a history play. And anyway, I was stunned by the fact that I could follow the action and the plot and the characters and who was against who was in league with each other, all of the deceptions. I followed it perfectly clearly, even though I was probably picking up maybe 30% of the depth of the language that was being thrown at me so quickly. And that just revealed to me the power of acting, which is what this medium was, right? These actors use body positioning, their physical space around the stage, the way that they deliver the lines, the tone, the inflections, right? Just as when you're sarcastic with somebody, you say something totally different than when you're dead serious.
Yeah.
And that's something we have to remember when we do this. Now, that being said, there is a lot of reason to read Shakespeare too, right? After you've seen the play, right? If you can't see a theatrical production, a good theatrical production, then I highly recommend some film adaptations. In particular, with Hamlet, Kenneth Branagh made in the mid-90s, he made a film adaptation of Hamlet. It's the entire script. It's unabridged, and it's stacked with some pretty top-notch actors. A lot of whom have also been Shakespearean actors too. So if you can't get to a stage play, I highly recommend watching a film adaptation first, and then go and read the play. And then you can get into the language of Shakespeare and all of the layers and all the reasons we love him today, and he's the reasons he's still relevant as a writer.
But you still haven't told me why I shouldn't be scared. It's an intimidating thing. I read not too long ago. I need to go look up where I read this, that educators are saying that the people alive today are the last people that will be able to read Shakespeare without translation. I read some Chaucer, like in the original, and you can. It's Middle English. It's not Elizabethan. It's another 400 years before this. I think 350 years, something like that, before Shakespeare. It's Middle English, but it shares enough. The Middle English shares enough with modern English that you can parse through it. But it's tough sledding, and reading Hamlet shared some of those characteristics, right? It shared some of the trouble I had with Chaucer, I had with Shakespeare.
Sure.
Now, that being said, I was still able to enjoy the thing. You said that the play, the Branagh play is 4 hours. I probably read this in 5.
Yeah, right.
So I was reading at a fairly decent pace, just slightly slower than one would speak it on the stage, maybe. And I was able to get through it. It's tough though. I mean, I won't kid anyone. In the introduction to this Norton Critical Edition, I have it had a bunch of essays about the history, the economics, the stagecraft, of Elizabethan England, and in those introductory notes, they said that Shakespeare uses about 25,000 total words in his vocabulary, and that someone like his contemporary Christopher Marlowe is using like 12,000.
Right. And what did they say that there's kind of a common number thrown around for like the average scholar, like university scholar knows.
Oh, like
what is it? 10,000 words?
Yeah, like 8. Yeah,
8,000 words. Yeah, something like that.
And one of the things about Shakespeare that is actually very frustrating is that when he needs a word and he doesn't have one, he'll coin one.
Right.
So many words. Oh, well, this is funny. We haven't even talked about Hamlet yet. This is funny. When I was a kid, there were these commercials on TV for Blue Star ointment. Did you ever see these commercials?
Blue Star? No.
It's just this quackery. I looked it up this morning. It's still for sale. Blue Star ointment, and they said that you could use it to treat jock itch, psoriasis, eczema, tetter. And around my house, it was always a joke, like, "Oh, I've got tetter." We didn't know what is tetter, and so
right.
When Claudius pours the poison in King Hamlet's ear when he's asleep, it tetters his skin.
Yeah,
he gets tetter.
So were you imagining a little product placement in there,
yeah.
like the Blue Star label, conveniently facing outwards as Claudius pours the poison?
yeah. So he uses these words that, I mean, he just has so many words, and I don't.
Right.
They said the average, scholars has 8,000. I'm going to guess that I do 8, 10. But man, he's just overwhelming, and
absolutely, and I think that's probably the number one thing that people get hung up on with Shakespeare's plays. But I'd remind you, so in terms of not being scared in approaching these plays, I'd remind you that you got to remember Shakespeare is writing for. It's actually really impressive. He's writing for a very broad audience.
Yeah,
and this is something that's very different from the way that media is consumed today. So when we think about our forms of media, television, books, film, etc., it's very fragmented, and it tends to be very niche. So people can find whatever their thing is, whatever genres they like, whatever mediums they like, and go find a vast wealth of that stuff. And there's, in fact, all of the algorithms that drive our searches for that stuff point us to more of the same thing, right? So we can all find exactly what appeals to us. But Shakespeare didn't have that, right? There weren't that many forms of entertainment available in his day, so he had to produce plays that satisfied the common people, right? That were not educated, that were not literate, by and large. He had to satisfy the merchant class, right? That had some means about them, but perhaps weren't as educated as say the aristocracy, the landed gentry. He had to satisfy all of these different groups of people from vastly different educational backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. And so they all have different touchstones of things that they're going to relate to. And that's part of the brilliance, is that he found a way to kind of weave his language and write these beautifully complex and layered, verse that also was, he got in some fart jokes too at the same time.
Right.
The classic one, this is not a Hamlet quote, but we'll certainly get to some more Hamlet quotes. But the classic one I always think about is from Romeo and Juliet. Everybody knows this line: "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Right? You remember that line? Well, a rose in slang terms was, that's the female genitalia, right? It's
Right.
vagina. And so on the one hand, he's playing to the crass, the audience, he's making a joke about, Juliet and a rose. But at the same time, that's quite a beautiful romantic line. I mean, that's one of the all-time best romantic lines that's ever been delivered. So I think that's something that can give you courage as you approach Shakespeare, is to know that he was writing for you,
Right.
not just the wealthy, educated people. He was writing for you too.
Yeah. If you look at a map of London, contemporary London, like the Globe Theater, was right across the street from a bear baiting arena. So there were people that are like, "Well, honey, what are we going to do tonight?" And she's like, "Well, we can go catch Hamlet, or we can watch the dog fights."
Yeah,
So
exactly.
It's so strange.
Exactly.
So I read Hamlet. I read the whole darn thing. Like I said, I read the combined text. There are 3 editions of this thing that are out there, and sometimes they combine them all. Sometimes they cut out some chunks. Sometimes it's just quarto 1, quarto 2, folio 1. And so I read the long one just because I wanted to get it all.
Yeah, the first folio edition.
Yeah. It's all in here. There's ghost stories, international politics, regicide, suicide, madness. It's all in here.
Yeah. So first of all, maybe we should point out that this is a tragedy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in broad terms, tragedies end in death, comedies end in marriage or union. So we kind of know up front that this is a tragic play.
For sure. It's a bummer, man. It's a bummer. This doesn't work out for anyone.
No.
Which is interesting. If you're like, okay, honey, do we go to the bear baiting tonight, or do we go to the play? And you go to the play, and then you just get your guts pulled out like this.
Right.
Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Like I like Disney movies, particularly like pre-1980 Disney movies.
Yeah.
All the parents die. I mean, they're just brutal.
They're based off the original fairy tales.
Yeah. And they're just brutal. And I've always thought, I remember being a little kid watching Bambi thinking, why are we watching this? Like, why do we do that?
Right.
And Aristotle talks about this stuff and his poetics, and talks about catharsis. And a lot of people have a lot to say about this. And I've read a lot of people's ideas, but I still don't understand why we do that.
Well, I think one of the notes that I wrote down about Hamlet is that I wrote down that Hamlet is a quintessential modern character. And I think, I don't know how people might have interpreted him at the time that Shakespeare first staged this play. But I believe today that I think a lot of young men in particular could identify with Hamlet very strongly. And the reason I say he's a quintessential modern character is because when I think of the terms, like when I think of the terms of conflict in ancient literature, typically you see man versus God, or the gods,
Fate.
Man versus nature, or man versus other man, right? That's the nature of most conflict. But when I think of Hamlet, both the character and the play, I think the main conflict in this play is it's Hamlet versus himself.
Yeah, it's a coming of age story.
It's a coming of age story.
Yeah, he's I don't know how old he is. How old is he?
It's not given to us, but we have some clues, right? So he attends Wittenberg University. His friend Horatio, that's one of his friends from university. So I assume that he's probably a young man, probably early 20s, if I had to guess.
I peg him younger than that. I figure
maybe a little bit younger,
18, 19. They would have gone to university earlier, and it's not a 4-year gig at that time.
Sure.
I figure he's 18 or 19. You say he's modern. He is. He's snarky. He's a shitty, snide kid. He back talks all the time. Maybe appropriately so. His family's degenerate and terrible, at least the ones that are living. It could easily be done as a story about divorce, His father has been killed, and his mom remarries the murderer. But his
Very
dad's
quickly.
gone very quickly, within weeks or months, early, a few months. And I was reading it thinking, this is every post-adolescent young man product of divorce story.
Right.
The resentment. I mean, of course, his mother remarries the uncle who's a regicide. He killed his father. But this is the angst and the trouble that he has is the trouble that any young man, any post-adolescent young man would have in the wake of a divorce and losing their dad.
Right, exactly. And that's the tragic element to this. I think any young man, though, regardless if you've experienced something that tragic, can relate to the fact that, at some point when you reach adulthood, you start to look at your parents and you realize they're just people.
Hopefully you get to see that. You know what? I know a guy who's in his 50s and his father is ailing, and he was talking about his mom, and he's just now seeing his parents as people.
Wow.
And I was talking to this guy, and I don't want to rat him out. He might be listening. I was talking to this guy, and he was expressing all of this stress and turmoil in him in helping his parents negotiate these health problems. And I was like, man, I didn't say anything to him, but like the root of all of this is he doesn't realize his mom's fallible and that his dad's going to die. I mean, it was like talking to a 12-year-old about it. And he's a smart guy. One of the reasons that this guy has that problem is because his parents are so solid.
Yeah.
And I think that Hamlet's dad was solid.
From what we hear of him, yeah. Hamlet talks about him very fondly.
Yeah, everyone does. And I think that he probably depended on his father being there to help shepherd him into adulthood and then take the reins of state. And then suddenly that was ripped away. And then he saw his mom for the treacherous opportunist, or maybe she's not even a treacherous opportunist. Maybe she's just a passive person who just acts at whim, and she just ends up being swept away. I mean, at best, she ends up being swept away in the situation and remarrying. At worst, she's treacherous, and we don't really know. Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of one of the, to your point, that's one of Hamlet's kind of fundamental conflicts, right? Is that the way he sees the situation is very black and white. Oh, you treacherous woman. How could you have married another man weeks after your husband died?
Right.
However, and I think this is interesting. I'd like to get into this later on. Is this play is a little unique, as far as I know, in that there are not very many female characters.
Yeah.
Most Shakespeare plays have some pretty interesting and strong female characters, but we really don't have much here. We've got Gertrude, that's the queen that remarries, and we've got Ophelia, who is Hamlet's sort of love interest. But they end up being rather fragile characters. And I think part of it is, I think you just hit on it, right? Is that, the reality is probably Gertrude, she didn't have any power in that court. What was she going to do?
Well, I thought about that. I thought, what should WWGD, what would Gertrude do? And I don't claim, I don't know what secession in that state looks like. But I would think that when the minute King Hamlet gets murdered, I would think that young Hamlet is the king, is the heir, and that all she had to do, and until this happens, he seems to be an erudite, considerate young man on his way to being a benevolent king. I think.
Right.
I think all she had to do was kind of sit on her hands and help her young son, take up the reins of state and cruise it out. Then she ends up being the queen mother, though, which is a different situation than maybe she wanted. I don't know. But these are questions that, I mean, when you read the thing, you're like, what is she doing? Why isn't she doing that? And he doesn't answer that, and he doesn't answer those things on purposely. He doesn't answer those.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what I wrote down is that I see Hamlet as being a young man that's coming to terms with an unfair world. And I can imagine that at university he probably would have been studying the great philosophers, some of the very same works that we have read and discussed on this podcast already.
And by the way, he's at Martin Luther's university.
That's right. Yeah, he's Wittenberg, which is in Germany.
Yeah. So Shakespeare is here in Elizabethan England. We've had the crazy religious ferment in England since Henry VIII that maybe Martin Luther kicked off. So Shakespeare is this English guy writing about a Danish king who went to school, and I was like, where's this going to go? He went to school at Wittenberg, and I'm like, where's this going to go? Is he going to bring this back to the Protestant Reformation somehow? And I didn't see it.
No, I didn't see that connection. However, I think that it is interesting. There are a few mentions of philosophy in the text, and philosophy. It is Hamlet seems to use as a touchstone. It's interesting. The word reason appears several times. I want to say 15 or 20 times in the text, but philosophy specifically appears a couple of times, and it seems to point to this idea that Hamlet is looking for a reason for things that are happening in the world, like according to some order or some moral code, and it just doesn't work that way. What I think is kind of interesting is I can imagine him coming from Wittenberg. It's full of ideas. I remember when I was 19, right? You probably remember when you were 19, and the world was fairly black and white at that stage. There was right and there was wrong, and right was to be praised, wrong was to be punished and avenged. And I think Hamlet's coming into this situation where he sees obvious wrong, right? It's revealed to him that his uncle has killed his father and taken the throne. Nobody else knows this. It's revealed by Hamlet's father in form of his ghost. But then there's other wrongs that are a little bit more gray, like Gertrude, like we've been talking about. Is she treacherous? Is she merely playing her part? Is she trying to survive? It's not entirely clear, right? And so I see that's interesting that philosophy and reason are kind of called upon, and yet this play is very clearly a play that's infected by everyone's emotions and passions.
Yeah, the whole thing is just fraught with ambiguity, which can be a little bit frustrating for me. And well, maybe we should just tell the story. Maybe we're ahead of ourselves.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not going to do a good job of it. This thing starts with a couple of with some of Hamlet's friends on a night watch, and they see a ghost, or they see what they think is a ghost, and they let Hamlet know, we've seen this ghost. It's your dad. And so he hangs out with them on the night watch to try to see the ghost, and sure enough, he gets to see the ghost, and it is his dad dressed in armor for war. And he tells him, "Hey, your uncle, I fell asleep in the orchard where I like to nap, and your uncle poured poison in my ear, and it curdled my blood and tethered my skin, and I was dead right there. And you need to go and avenge this." And then off he goes, and he instantly, I think he either goes mad or starts feigning madness almost instantly. Hamlet does.
Right.
He sees off some of his friends he sees off his friend Laertes that's going back to school. There's the great speech from Polonius, the weird contradictory advice that Polonius gives his son, which is my favorite part of the play.
Oh yes, yeah. Because you're like, wait a minute, is Polonius, like, he's serious, but is he senile?
Right.
Yeah, he kind of seems a little senile.
Let's read it. So his son's getting ready to leave. He's getting ready to get on the boat, and he says, "Look, thou character, give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought is act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. Those friends thou hast, in their adoption tried, grapple them into thy soul with hoops of steel, but do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new-hatched, unfledged courage. Beware of entrance to quarrel, but, being in, bear that the opposed may be aware of thee, and give every man thy ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. Costly thy habit. Okay, this is where it gets weird. Costly thy habit, as thy purse can buy, but not expressed in fancy, rich, not gaudy. For the apparel oft proclaims the man, and they in France of the best rank and station are of a most select and generous chief, and generous chief in that. Neither borrower nor lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell. My blessing season this in thee. Is he saying buy the best clothes that you can, but
not too good,
but not fancy clothes?
Yeah, not too good.
Right?
Buy Brooks Brothers, not bespoke.
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. I actually think this speech reinforces kind of what I was saying about Hamlet's, and really the question for all of the young people in this play, and one of the conflicts they have to deal with is the conflict of living up to an ideal and yet being your own person, right? And forming an identity, right? Your own identity. And this is Polonius is saying this kind of, it comes across humorous, right? And that he's trying to give his son this advice, and on the surface, none of it's bad advice.
Right.
I mean, these are kind of just a bunch of, he's just kind of stringing together a bunch of old saws and axioms and aphorisms.
People that haven't read this have heard so much of this. Neither a borrower nor lender be, to thine own self be true. I mean, it's full of things that we're just swimming in Shakespeare's soup, whether you want to or not.
That's right. Exactly. But, I can see the conflict in, I think a lot of young men today struggle with being themselves, being men, and carrying themselves as men, and yet trying to uphold or trying to hold themselves to the ideal of society, right? It's like, they ought to be men, they ought to be brave, independent, courageous, rugged, all whatever adjectives you want to give to manhood and masculinity, and yet they should be considerate,
right?
They should be sensitive, they should be understanding, they should stand up for women. On both sides, these all sound like great things, but often you end up putting people in this situation like, well, what am I? Do I stand for anything? If I'm neither this nor that, I'm a little bit of this, but not too much of that. Am I anything? And this is interesting because when we get back to Hamlet specifically, he often in his soliloquies laments his own cowardice, his lack of action, right? I take that as a lack of resolve. He sees the situation and he evaluates it pretty fairly, but he's just crippled by analysis paralysis. He's crippled to the point where he has trouble taking action and actually standing on a point that he believes in.
Well, it's so hard to figure out what he believes in. I mean, on one hand, it's analysis paralysis, but he's in a tough spot. He's in a tough spot. I have to continue to shit on Polonius. This is like this is boomer posting. It's like just boomer tier advice. You got these young men that are, we know what Hamlet's going to be dealing with, and part of what he's going to be dealing with is in fact Polonius,
right?
And this old guy is doing his best, I think, to tell his son what he thinks he should know, and then the truth of it is these guys have to go pick up the wreckage that these adults have left them. Yeah.
And so let's just quickly explain who Polonius is. So Polonius is he is the advisor to the king. So he's kind of the right hand man of formerly King Hamlet and now King Claudius.
Yeah, and he's Hamlet's girlfriend's Ophelia's dad.
That's right. Yeah. So Laertes and Ophelia, brother and sister. Polonius is the dad.
Yeah. So Hamlet's already nuts at this point, And maybe. And Polonius says, gosh, why is he crazy? And Ophelia's like, he told me he didn't love me. And so Polonius and Claudius hatched this plan to figure out if Hamlet is crazy or lovesick, if he's being affected by his love for Ophelia. And Polonius, hides out. They have Ophelia and Hamlet have this weird interaction where he rejects her, is cruel to her, in my opinion. And then they say, it ain't love, probably. It ain't love. And then things just get worse and worse and worse, and then everyone dies. And that's Hamlet.
Right. Yeah, so I think, there's another plot to this that's important because, as we often see in Shakespeare plays, there are, for every major character, there's typically a mirror or a foil. And going on in the background while all this is happening at court, Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, right? So he's Elsinore is the castle that they reside in Denmark, and Hamlet's father, the elder King Hamlet, had captured some lands from Norway, and Norway is governed by an aging king who's we're taken to understand he's somewhat senile and just on his deathbed. But there's the young Fortinbras, and Fortinbras is upset that Denmark stomped all over his kingdom, so he is seeking vengeance on Denmark. And so in the background, Fortinbras we see is kind of this hot-headed young man, probably the same age as Hamlet or similar age, that is marching on, or is plotting to march on Denmark. And so at the kind of the finale of the play, we have all of the incestuous and deceitful goings on in Elsinore come to a head, and then Fortinbras is also his conflict with Denmark comes to a head, and he arrives in Denmark to take over, only to realize that it is entirely in a state of disarray.
Yeah, I think it's Chekhov said, if there's a gun over the mantelpiece in the second act, somebody's going to use it before the end of the play. Something like that. And so they bring up this Fortinbras character early on in the play, kind of apropos of nothing. Like, what's going on? I'm like, he's going to be back. And sure enough, he is. And ends up inheriting, there's 8 dead people, I think, at the end of the play. And Fortinbras picks up, and he ends up being the king of Denmark as a result of that. It's so weird. Such a strange goddamn story.
It is. Yeah, and I think to me, the story just begs for you to look inside the conflict of the characters' minds, primarily, because the actual plot in terms of what happens externally in the play is, it's kind of bizarre. There's really not much that happens except for Fortinbras taking over. It's almost kind of a black comedy in a way, in that Fortinbras shows up all ready to bash some heads in.
Right.
And he shows up with his army, takes over Elsinore, and is like, oh, well, I guess I'm king.
Right. That was easy.
It's almost comic in the way that it occurs.
There's all this weird intrigue. Like I said, there's, the sort of geopolitical stuff in here between Denmark and the Fortinbras and all of this interfamilial stuff. And I was like, gosh, how did he get away with this? We're talking about the wreckage of Henry VIII's reign. They've been living in England. They've been living among that wreckage for 50, 60 years at this point. They've had Bloody Mary Tudor. She's killed Mary Queen of Scots at this point, I think, already, which is, another country at this point, right? Scotland ain't England at this point. Norway, or Denmark and Norway. I mean, it's sort of similar. Edward has died, and his sister's taken over, who's the bastard. It's just so weird. And I can't say that there are exact parallels in this sort of Tudor England story in Hamlet, but I'm like, man, he's he's flirting with critiquing a dangerous situation in his home state.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, and it's been a long time since I've studied this, in any sort of scholarly manner, but I believe Hamlet was written in the Elizabethan period because
late, like nobody really knows 1600, 1603. I had to go look it up. So is that Elizabeth or is it Charles or it's right at the end.
So Shakespeare wrote during the time period of Elizabeth in the early part of his career and the later part of his career under King James, right?
Mm-hmm. I said Charles, and it's James.
Yeah, and that marked a significant change in the political atmosphere because, am I right? Is that James?
James,
the Jacobean king?
Yeah, James was king of Scotland. Elizabeth kicks the bucket. She had already killed Mary, Queen of Scots, thereby making James the king of Scotland. She dies. He's the heir. And now England and Scotland are united under one crown. I think he's James II of Scotland, but James I of England.
Okay. Yeah. That's ringing a bell. So there's definitely a different political environment, and you can kind of tell. I think if I remember correctly, a lot of Shakespeare's plays got a little bit more abstract after that point.
Right.
So yeah, I think he was. I think he. Like all great artists, he was able to work himself to a point where his stories were so compelling and so interesting and entertaining that they were undeniable.
Right.
And he was able to afford some license to comment and critique on his own time, for sure.
And it's interesting to think about, you say his own time. When was that? Well, it's 1600, 1602, 1603, King James, the King James version of the Bible that we're all so familiar with. And Jamestown in 1603 in the New World. So, the United States, or what will become the United States, is starting to form at this point. I mean, Jamestown doesn't make it. It's 1603. It's still very, very early. But this isn't ancient history, is my point. This is not ancient history.
Yeah, very, very good point. Very good point. No, it's not ancient history. And in fact, taking this back from a linguistic standpoint, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the inventions of Shakespeare's time in terms of language survive today, right? And as you said,
what are those? Kind of like the aside and the breaking the fourth wall, that kind of thing, or
that's right, yeah. And so that's a great point, right? So you've got the soliloquy, right, as we call it, where an actor would address the audience directly, as opposed to the other characters in the play, and that breaking the fourth wall, if you will. There are, asides as well, comical asides. But there's also, just in terms of language, right? This is the emergence of modern English, right? Emerging from the medieval languages and kind of the mixture of Latin and Germanic and languages and French and all that stuff. And now we have English emerging as its own sort of standalone language. And as you said, a lot of times there weren't great expressions for the things that needed to be said. And so there was a lot of invention in language at this time. You mentioned it earlier when Polonius was trying to determine whether Hamlet was pulling his leg or actually going mad. And he says, at one point, he comes to the conclusion, he says, this is madness, yet there is method in it, right?
Yep.
So there's another one for you. So there's a method to the madness.
I made a list. Should we go down? Let's go down through this list.
Oh, yeah.
Holy smoke, man.
All right, so I'll start with one. In my mind's eye is mentioned a couple times as a figure of speech.
This one is one of my favorites. I don't know that it's so popular. I don't know if it's in the common usage, but there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Oh, yes.
You know that one?
Yeah.
I had thought for years and years, that was Julian of Norwich, weird English mystic, Catholic mystic. And then later on, found it there in Hamlet and then ran across it again. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking make it so. That's so good. Write that down.
Well, that's the whole play in a nutshell, right?
Yeah.
Moral relativity.
Of course, the to be or not to be speech is in here.
Yes. Yep.
to die, to sleep, perchance to dream.
Perchance to dream.
That's in a Fiona Apple song.
Man, that's a blast from the past, Fiona Apple.
Yeah. Brevity is the soul of wit.
Yep.
Of course, this above all to thine own self be true.
We have every dog will have his day. That there's the root of that is in the gravedigger scene.
The lady doth protest too much, methinks.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, you can see this just stacked with references we still use today.
Something's rotten in the state of Denmark. There's
another one that I noted was, and this is not a common figure of speech today, but rather just a callback to we often talk about these books as being part of a conversation, right? And these works, I should say, being part of a great conversation. And we have an ancient Greek or Trojan reference in the play, right? At some point, Hamlet's friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, which are called by the King Claudius. So Claudius says, I need to keep an eye on Hamlet because he's suspicious that Hamlet might know of his treachery. So Claudius invites Hamlet's kind of grade school friends over to keep an eye on him, basically. And they happen upon a group of players, an acting company that Hamlet happens to know, and they invite them to the court. And so Hamlet asks, as they show up to the court, the players all show up to the court, he asks the head of the acting company, says, hey, there was a speech that you once gave, and I thought it was really great. And it's the speech of from a play that's recounting the death of Priam, right? So the king of Troy, right? So it's calling back to the Aeneid, the story of the fall of Troy that also would have been in the Iliad as well. And again, we have a regicide.
Right.
Right. This is a story of Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, killing King Priam, who was the king of Troy, during the fall of Troy.
Yeah, and
so this is absolutely, and there's definitely this play was written with an eye towards that conversation that we talk about. Well, that is the end of part 1 of my conversation with Scott about Hamlet. Hope you enjoyed it. There's so much to unpack about this play. As we mentioned before, the stage production typically runs somewhere around 4 hours. That's probably one of the longest Shakespeare plays. It might be the longest out there. And Scott and I ended up talking about this for over an hour and a half. So we're going to cut it in half for you. Next week, we're going to dive deeper into the text and talk about Hamlet's soliloquies. There are 7 in total, and discuss how they represent a major subplot. So while the intrigue is happening at court, there's this internal conflict that's happening in Hamlet's mind, and the soliloquies are our window into his mind and his soul. And really the internal conflict and the questions that Hamlet has to grapple with and that the play asks us, the audience, to grapple with as well. So hope you enjoyed that. Join us next week. In the meantime, head on over to onlinegreatbooks.com and sign up for the VIP list if you haven't already. Get access to some cool freebies, and your name will be first on the list next time enrollment opens up to join Online Great Books so you can read plays like Hamlet. You can also follow Online Great Books on Instagram at Online Great Books and check out some of the very dank memes that our chief memologist, Josh Worsham, posts there. All right, that's it for now. We'll see you next week.